Welcome to Bleach Revisited. I am Karkur Gold, your host of the series, in which we usually read a chapter of the Bleach manga, discuss the art and the narrative, as well as my personal response to the chapter and how it connects to the rest of the series. However, I'd like to do something different with this episode. I'd like to spend a little bit of time just talking about the first 100 chapters in a new series that I'll be doing every 100 chapters, about 2 years of publication. I just want to give a basic overview of what surprised me, what maybe I didn't like as much on this revisit, just a kind of a gestalt of where I am on the entirety of the thing. As usual, this won't have any spoilers in it. I'll try to leave, if I do have anything to say spoiler wise, I'll leave that for the end. But yeah, let's get started. First 100 chapters of Bleach. I think the first big thing to address is that of course, I enjoyed It's Bleach. It's one of my favorite series. Even revisiting it, I find a lot to like here. I really like Kubo's style. I think I'd always been under the impression that I liked his sort of sketchier style a lot more. That I like the more kind of angular, like almost punk designs of these early sort of ways that the characters are portrayed. That said, as Kubo develops, he really develops a more anatomically precise way of presenting his characters rather than as much of a stylized way. And I do like his styles. It's very, I think people may rightfully say it's a somewhat Toriyama reminiscent. And I certainly like the style that's present in his previous manga that he wrote whenever he was in high school. Um, Zombie Powder. I like the style that has, and Bleach really carries a lot of that. That said, I like the way it goes because Kubo gains a lot more confidence with his line work and his spread panels and the way that he portrays these characters. But one thing that actually really surprised me that I didn't expect as much of, and we get more and more of it as the Soul Society arc starts, but that he really uses his paneling to establish like these very emotional just panels of the characters' expressions without using words, just using the visuals and the paneling and the space on the page to really give a sense of things. And I think I noticed it especially further in the Soul Society arc whenever Renji is going to bring Rukia to the tower. I had a whole, on that episode, I talked about it in pretty great detail because it was hitting me really hard. But that was a moment that I didn't think, and I think in general, Renji's really surprised me the most. Out of all the characters, I think that's what I am surprised with absolutely on this reread. He's the biggest surprise for me because on my initial read of Bleach, whenever I read it weekly, I didn't give a damn about Renji. I'm gonna be real. I didn't. I like Renji was like he was always not like a joke to me, but he always felt like a stepping stone. He always felt like somebody that was just getting in the way of the real battle, of the real conflicts. Like that, he was always, I guess, secondary to Ichigo in terms of like his pursuits and his capabilities. I kind of read it as a generic shonen reader where I was like, well, he's weaker, so I don't like him as much. But then more than that, like I guess he doesn't get fed a W very often, so it's easy to kind of see him as a less desirable character in that way. But maybe also because he's sort of runs counter to Ichigo in a lot of ways. That he's this soft antagonist where it's clear that he's going to kind of come over, or at least that like he'll eventually be on Ichigo's side. It feels that way, and ultimately that's where we get near the end of this 100 chapters. Is that Renji really has this arc where he comes to the point where he's begging Ichigo to save Rukia, right? And that's kind of journey that he has in the very short time. I mean, I think he gets introduced around chapter like 60ish. I could be wrong. The end of the first kind of arc, but yeah, Renji really surprised me. Um, just in terms of like how emotional his arc is, like how much that resonates more with me. His connection to Rukia, the sort of tensions that he feels, like being a Soul Reaper, but also having this intimate connection with somebody and seeing them like that fade and them essentially have to die. And like, what are you going to do about that? Or do you even have the power to do anything about that? Like trying to handle that stoically, but also trying to kind of internally fight it over like, well, hey, you could actually change something maybe. Um, and ultimately him recognizing Ichigo as like this power for change. Ichigo in a lot of ways ends up being like this catalyst for change and this real representative force of like not just the strength of personal bonds and convictions, but also in that ability to affect change. And I think that's really effective for a lot of reasons. I mean, you have your usual shonen stuff of the power of friendship, right? But like by defining it through these very human modes, like, yeah, I care about my family, I care about the people that I've actually like lived and had this connection to, and I don't give a damn about anybody else. Like, why the fuck do I care about a stranger? Like, Ichigo rings is more human because of that, and the whole like, oh, power of friendship stuff doesn't come off as some like kiddie, sort of like whatever. I'm trying to think of like pearlistizing. What I'm pronouncing that I'm completely wrong, but essentially, it's not trying to be moralistic. It's not trying to be overwrought in the way that it's presenting like a moral. Like, yeah, friends are important. Don't you know it? It's like, yeah, Ichigo feels very realistic in the ways that he cares about the people close to him and his family and all of that. I mean, people close to him epitomizes it. And I think the really cool thing that Bleach does is really quickly establishes its cast and their strengths and weaknesses, as well as its themes and how it's going to play with those themes. And that's, I think, one of the things that I love the most about Bleach, and something that I will always critique Naruto and One Piece for, is that I don't feel like either of them is nearly as thematically consistent. Now, heads up, I mentioned those series because they're the large contemporaries to Bleach. They're often, again, they're the big three. They're the ones that they're always compared amongst each other. They were the large, most popular series in Shonen Jump at the time of all their publication, which they started publication within about, 5 years, I think, tops. It's maybe closer to 4. But basically, late 90s, early 2000s, I believe, was all of them. So, yeah. Whew, good stuff. Never mind, idiot. Like, I could talk forever about Naruto and One Piece. I haven't finished all of One Piece, so take that with a grain of salt. I have read all of Naruto. I read that as it was being published. I haven't read any of Boruto, but I feel like that's a completely divorced product. It has nothing to do with Naruto, other than set dressing, really, in my opinion. It's not even the same team working on it, so I think Kishimoto might be writing it, Masashi, whatever the guy's name is, but I don't think that he's drawing any of it, and I don't know how much of it is just like someone else's project entirely. I couldn't tell you. I thought he did like Samurai 8 or something instead. Maybe I should be better informed about this stuff. Whatever. As a reminder, this video will be unscripted, as is this entire series. But yeah, I think that the first 100 chapters does a really good job of setting up those themes, of setting up, what we're going to be looking at of like the individual versus society, change versus like stagnation, um, the human heart and like the conflicts that it deals with, death and the way in which our relationship to death and the loss of people that we're close to, right? Those are all really big in there, and it's easy to kind of maybe forget that one is a part of it until it comes up again. It's like, oh yeah, that's right. This is what it's primarily concerned with, and ultimately, yeah, I distill it down to those, especially. Um, I mean, obviously, it's a supernatural series, so it's the characters' relationship to each other, and then having death being a thing that relates in. It all fits really naturally, and I think that's one of the things that I didn't appreciate as much on my initial read, and I think if you're going to take anything away from my channel, take that Bleach's narrative is really well handled. As much as you might have issues with the way that character plots are handled, or that certain things are balanced, or that certain structures get reused, which again, I would argue that they get reused for good purpose, and for different means, and that the reuse of them is intentional to make you go, oh, I recognize that structure, and then to do something interesting with it. A lot of people just go, oh, this is being reused, it must be bad. They don't realize like why, or they don't think about why. People are really quick to critique something. Like that's one of the things I always will mention is the critiques Bleach gets that I feel often aren't warranted, and a lot of them are critiques that have this sort of implicit argument that it's bad because it's one way. So like one that you'll often hear is like Ichigo is a reactionary protagonist. He doesn't go about doing things himself. He reacts to pressures that are put upon him, as if like that's a bad thing to be, or doesn't make a plot work. I would say that Ichigo doesn't exactly fall 100% within that anyway, but yes, he reacts to different stimuli much like a person would. Who knew? And I think the story works perfectly fine and is, again, really effective because it is about an individual being put under these different pressures and how they respond to those pressures. And ultimately, at the end of the day, whenever pressures are put upon you by both your personal bonds and the society, and like the rules and strictures that might estrange you from those bonds, which way do you break? That's a big kind of question that this focuses on. What's truly significant? What drives people? What can give them strength? And I like that all gets rolled into the power system in Bleach too. That hollows are essentially empowered by the frustration they have over this loss, right? Over their own death or the deaths of others. That there are essentially these souls that are incomplete because of their connection to things. I think that's really cool. And then when we get to the Soul Reaper and then Zanpakuto, which we haven't really gotten into a lot of the nuance of the Zanpakuto, but from what we've learned from Ichigo and Zangetsu, that you have this living bond, right? With like that like it is this externalization of your essence that you fight alongside, and that you basically like your sword is a manifestation of your will. And it's not just a manifestation of your will as in a characterization of it, but it literally derives its cutting power by your resolve. And like that's something that we got like with Kisuke talking about like the resolve to kill, and can you hear my blade with that resolve? And it's as metaphorical as it is literal. And I love that like a character, like so much of this series like takes where the characters are and the character's mental state and their character's connections to things and makes them manifest, right? What be it like manifest into a monster or into a cool sword. And I like that. Like there's so much. I think that's another thing that people don't talk about very much is the way in which Bleach handles its themes really, really tightly. And I think one of the really cool things that you see happening is, of course, Ichigo using Soul Reaper powers and learning to use the Soul Reaper powers. It's like Soul Reapers as an institution have this strength of the Zanpakuto, right? And like there's this sort of intersection between individuality as well as being a part of the whole, right? And I love that what we're getting in these chapters, and I haven't even commented on this, but like in the later chapters in Soul Society, we're starting to get these like moments where it's like, okay, you can use your Zanpakuto freely, but like so like it's like they can only use this extension of themselves, whenever under dire circumstances, like even that aspect is in control because it's such like even though it's a militaristic society, they're under such stringent control of their lives. Even these really powerful characters like the captains and the vice captains, um, they're not allowed to like have their swords out in Seirete and all of that, but until of course the Ryoka invasion happens that we get. So I think that's really cool that like basically Ichigo, we see him as an individual, like he has to essentially use and usurp the power of the society, like the societal power that's afforded to him. He has to enter into some sort of like relationship with that, but he's able to assert that power as his own and still keep it as his own personal sort of power. And ultimately, that power that everybody has is their own power. It's just the society that forces them to use it in different ways, which is really cool. And we'll see that throughout Bleach. Like whenever I had that realization of like how much the power system in Bleach really does reflect the themes of not just one's individuality versus their relationship to like these larger hierarchical structures. Um, and like like the exertion of one's will into the outside world versus how much they're willing to essentially allow their will to be subsumed by a larger sort of will. Again, the individual versus society, but also just like the self and the relationship to death too comes up, especially with the Hollows. And ultimately the Hollows, the only reason they stick around is like to become Hollows is because they are so willful, because they want to exert this will, and that will, that sort of everything that pushes that will becomes corrupt and twisted over time. And I don't know, that's just so cool. It's so cool. And so yeah, I think that's the biggest, like one of the biggest things of rereading Bleach is just the appreciation that I have for thematically kind of how consistent it is and how much those themes are woven into almost every aspect of the narrative, from the power systems to the characters to the kind of ultimate plotting of things. The other big surprise for me, other than Renji, I say Renji as a character, which I didn't like him as much on my first read, and I sincerely do love that character now. I think he adds so much to the series. The other thing that really gets me is that a lot of people will often complain that they really like the early stuff, like the school stuff, the sort of substitute Shinigami stuff, but then they felt like the series kind of overshot itself, like jumped the shark kind of by going into this larger scale, involving itself with the Shinigami. And there's a lot of people that will also say like, okay, well, all the stuff with Aizen's death and all of the stuff with the conspiracy and Rukia really feels like a story that doesn't have to do with Ichigo. And they'll start to be this argument that like the scope of the story expands so largely and becomes about these Soul Society characters in a way that doesn't really align with what we had before. And I don't think that's true. I think that's a really short-sighted reading of things. And I used to be a little bit more um, understanding of that point. Like I used to kind of have that idea. Like I really like the original sort of style Bleach had for its art as well. Like this sort of more angular, stylized style that you'll see in a lot of this early art on these chapter covers. Uryu looking like this. He looks like a little boy, but he looks so different than he ends up looking, right? Um, like so much of especially those first like 4 volumes, that first year of Bleach's publication especially, there's just such a different kind of Kubo I think starts to undergo a growth as an artist, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But what I want to focus on is a lot of people really like stylistically as well as narratively what was going on in the first kind of half of this 100 chapters, right? All the substitute Shinigami stuff. Um, and then they felt like everything kind of gets out of place, and then it's like what are we doing going to Soul Society and all of that? I just want to have my little adventures, and I think the series was never going to be about like primary little adventures like that. One, because I think it's taking a lot out of the book of Yu Hakusho, which very much starts out the same way, where it's like, hey, let's do little like spirit adventures, and then we've got to do much bigger things, right? Um, but then two, I think the other big thing here is that even from the beginning, it was very clear that we were setting up Soul Society as a significant place, and that we were setting up this larger conflict of Rukia essentially doing this thing that is illegal in cultivating Ichigo, and the sort of issues that were going to come out of Rukia willfully engaging with that, right? That we get, Kisuke has that conversation with Rukia, and I think this volume, in volume 2, I'm pretty sure, whenever Kon shows up, and Kisuke has that conversation with Rukia about like, hey, this isn't going to go over that well. She's like, well, I'll deal with it. I'm ready to face the consequences, pretty much. And yeah, I think that's like such a strong like hook in that there's something going on in the shadows, and there's something going on with Rukia. And it becomes much more explicit, obviously, as we get closer and closer to those later volumes. Um, as we pull, finally to Broken Coda, right? Like that's certainly the case later. That like yeah, it becomes obvious that this is going to be about this connection that Ichigo has with Rukia and how far he's willing to go to save her and all of that. And so naturally, it's going to pull in all these other characters and get involved with all of, like the Soul Society. But yeah, my point is that people that think that the series should have always been that initial stuff are being negligent to how much it was setting the stage for going to Soul Society and opening up. And that, like, a lot of that stuff that's early on is significant because it's meant to introduce our characters, their powers, get the ball rolling before it provides a significant upset in that. If you look at the way that Kubo tends to kind of write, it usually is in this kind of familiar setup into a surprise, into a resolution of some sort, right? I mean, it's basic story structure, but it's one that Kubo, I think, specifically kind of makes use of. And a lot of people, I mean, if you look at that in the larger scope of things, right? The familiar setup is like okay, we've got our band of friends fighting things, and then the disruption is Byakuya and Renji showing up, bodying Ichigo, and then taking Rukia to be executed. And then, of course, the resolution is Ichigo and his allies going to save Rukia and the entire Soul Society arc. But then that introduces its own sort of setups and complications and resolutions, right? And so, yeah, I think there's like the sort of structure that we see smaller in the small scope is there in the large scope, and ultimately to be negligent of that, to think that like that is not what's going on. I don't know. It feels like it's dishonest to a degree. Like, yes, I do love the Rock and Future 7 stuff. Yes, I do love, just Ichigo and his friends. But so many of those early volumes and chapters, those are so rooted in the supernatural and rooted in kind of developing these characters and their relationship to the supernatural. There isn't, I think, a single chapter that's just focused on like solely like, hey, let's do some school stuff, or like the mundane. Every chapter has some element of the supernatural either looming or in direct conflict with our characters. And so it's only natural that it becomes brought to an end and our characters have to delve into this supernatural realm. And the reason why they do that is because they have this connection to this person. And of course, the supernatural realm represents not just, something that is perhaps, again, not natural, like a society, or at least, natural in the sense that, like, not naturally occurring in complete, like, I suppose, I was going to say complete chaos, but like without any sort of structure being forced upon it. Like I like that the supernatural follows this hierarchy, and that hierarchy begets Soul Society, and that Soul Society, in society itself, ends up being this kind of antagonistic force that Ichigo has to rally against. So again, the kind of the thematic is married to every element of this, and I love that. As far as things that kind of let me down a little bit, things that I wish were perhaps more present early on, I wish there was a little bit more with the magic and like the magic systems, because we only really see Rukia doing a lot of the Hado, and like she doesn't really make an effort to teach Ichigo that. And it's easy for me to kind of hand wave it with like, well, yeah, she went to Soul Reaper Academy for a fucking 100 years. What's she gonna teach Ichigo in a few months? It's just more realistic that she's not going to, and maybe Rukia is even able to gauge that Ichigo doesn't really have good control over like his spiritual capabilities. That he's like that faucet on full blast, that sort of thing. So would Ichigo even really be able to capable of like reining that in to form spells? That's a big question, right? So I don't begrudge that much, but I do wish that we got a little bit more, especially as we're starting to get into Soul Society. And I know that, like, yes, the first couple of people that we've had battles with have been from the more physically martial sort of side of things. So, fighting people from the 11th like Ikaku and Yumachika, I don't expect them to really be making use of a lot of like magic, you know. But it would have been cool to see some of that, perhaps from the what is the 7th Division guy, the Kametachi guy, Jidorobo. Yeah. Nevertheless, I just wish that there was a little bit more of that there early on, and that got maybe more expanded upon. But that's sort of a personal thing. Um, I will say, like, I wish there was a bit more in the way of character interaction among our main cast. Ichigo obviously gets front and center billing, and we've been getting a lot of Ichigo and Ganju, especially at the beginning of the later kind of volumes. And, like, I think that's cool. I wish that, like, and I know Chad's more of a silent character, but I love Chad. I wish there was a little bit more from Chad. And I wish that, especially, like, Uryu gets his time to shine, but I do wish that there was more from him after his arc was over, I think Orihime comes up a good amount, and I kind of like the position that she fills. I don't know. Ultimately, yeah, I find myself wanting more, which I think anytime a series has me wanting more of it, that's not a bad thing necessarily. I think, yes, there might be a sense of feeling unsatisfied because you haven't been given that more, but like because that what you did get was satisfying enough to make you want more. That's still, I think, praiseworthy of itself. And certainly in the next couple of chapters, I think we're going to get some more of that Chad stuff that I've been wanting for. I only wish that it was perhaps a little bit more present earlier on. Yeah, yeah. So like more interaction between our core characters, and I think this is something that will always be a strain, especially as you start to introduce more and more characters. Is it becomes, how do you balance those characters and their interactions while you're still trying to drive a narrative that's moving forward and is really focused on having that forward momentum and being really about this other part of this journey, and really finding places to do more than just characterize the characters, but really have them exist in dialogue and in scene with each other. I feel like Renji's been given a lot of space for that, which I have really appreciated on this read. And like Rukia, especially, I think Rukia has been phenomenal as far as like her dialogue is I think some of my favorite dialogue in the entire series so far. Which it's easy to kind of overlook. That is one of the things I think on my initial read of Bleach. I also didn't appreciate Rukia nearly as much as I do now. Whereas I think Rukia is in a very kind of interesting position. I like her character a lot. I appreciate kind of what she's affecting, and her ultimate decision to kind of shoulder this burden. And yeah, I think it's good stuff. I think it's all good stuff. Let me see. What other sort of things can I say? I think one thing that I will say that I reconsidered as well was I used to always consider that like I liked the early art a lot. Um, I tended to be one of the people that was on that kind of boat of saying like, oh, I really liked Bleach's early style. I liked it being a little bit more stylized. I wish more of that held throughout, because certainly Kubo gets a little bit more of a polished style going on. But I've come to appreciate how his line art has grown to have more confidence. And while, yes, he does end up having a little bit more in the way of kind of anatomically sort of correct figures as he moves forward, um, he ends up having a lot more confidence with his like large spreads, the way that he's pacing out his panels, the way that he's displaying this action and using it to flow throughout the page, and the shading especially. I think the shading's the biggest thing for me. Like I think also like, and you can see this in this first 100, is like the ways in which Kubo becomes a lot more confident with his shading styles and techniques. By the time that we get to volume 12, Flower on the Precipice, we get some really really cool kind of panels, just like with the shadows cast and the motion that characters can weigh on their face just by like the creases of their expression. It's really good stuff. So I think that's the biggest thing is like I've come to really appreciate maybe the change in Kubo's style more, and like the style that he develops a little bit more than just being nostalgic for the early stuff. I think it's cool, but I like the way it's changed. Anyway, I'm running right up on about 30 minutes right now, so I'm going to close this out. I just wanted to kind of touch on a little bit of what surprised me, what I liked, what I didn't like, all of what I've kind of talked about. Ultimately, I think the first 2 years of Bleach does a very good job of establishing itself and then getting us right into the meat and potatoes of a pretty saucy pot of plot. I think where it is 1 year in is really strong, especially that 100th chapter with Aizen getting killed and like everything going crazy. It's so good. Um, I mean, I think a lot of people would call this peak Bleach. I don't know if I necessarily agree, but rereading it, I certainly see the appeal, and I certainly see why I liked it, and I have more reasons to like it now. So yeah, it's good stuff. Thank you for joining me for this first 100 chapters. If you haven't watched the actual videos, feel free to go to the Bleach Revisited playlist. Watch, if you just want to watch for the chapters that you like, if you can remember certain chapters you like, or if you want to go to a certain volume, feel free. But for those of you who have watched all 100 of the episodes so far, thank you very much for sticking with it. I hope that the next 100 proves to be even more exciting. Definitely expecting some surprises. Definitely looking forward to seeing how my read of it has changed in the years since I read it originally. So, yeah, I do really enjoy this series, and I'm finding more to like about it. And I really appreciate you watching these videos. So, thank you so much. Have a wonderful time. Never forget that spirits are forever with you. Stay gold.